This is really exciting. You know, as Sarah mentioned, I was in the first class of fellows here at the Center for Fiction years ago, and the center has meant so much to me since then. So I just want to thank everyone from the center, Noreen Tomasi, Elise, Jasmine, Sarah, everyone else who's worked here and sort of done so much to bring this evening to fruition. Thanks to Tiffany, who I am a huge fan of, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with her work, but if not, you have a treat ahead. She's fantastic, and I'm so grateful to have the chance to be in conversation with her. And of course, all of you, my friends and family, for coming. I'm excited to share some work with you. So I'll jump in. I'm reading from a story called The Strange People, one of the stories that we're talking about. And it's actually, in some ways, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, one of the things that my work is very much concerned with is voice and the connections between voice and body. And so this is a story, I think, that, kind of thinks through voices and bodies in Black women's experience in particular. But first, some water. A Strange People. We, Chrissy, will let the white men see and touch our difference. She will smile for doctors and handlers, like Mrs. Susan's old China trinket dolls, tilt her head just so and laugh, her hand grabbing at our hemline. In the next town, we'll see branners and broadsides proclaiming our charm. We merely will not understand why they would write us that way. She will taste the word charm like coffee grounds in her mouth and wonder how they can put them so small and so neat beneath the headlines. Double-headed darky, united Negress freaks, two-headed African beast. We, Chrissy, will not have any questions about this. She will know that the nice words are for her. She is the one who's always hated us. When we were young, decades ago, we, Chrissy, wrote her version of our story, and everyone who knew us was surprised. She got most of the facts right, told about our slave birth and the scandal we caused on our first master's farm, how we were sold from Master John and Mrs. Susan, then slipped like a hunk of wet soap from hand to hand, master to master, growing up and filling out on the carnival circuit. She told how we saw things most North Carolina Negro girls wouldn't even think to dream of, the darting English steam cars, the white-chilled winter at the Cirque des Champs-Élysées. We, Chrissy, spent a few words on Wee Millie's favorite part of the life, when we ended up back in Mrs. Susan's arms. She said a couple of things about our life on the Midway, the place between the circus gates and the big top, where freak acts wander about and ballyhoo, squeezing awe from Norm's eyes like milk from fat cow's udders. Wee Chrissy is an all-star ballet, always has been. She preened and flaunted in her story too, playing our difference up and down to suit her audience. First it was a malformation, then it was a joy. Our joy was a curse we were proud of, she said, writing on our mind the paradox of our body. She refused to let them think for a second that the slightest drip of difference ran between we two. We are indeed a strange people, she began her story, and it continued on like that, a people, two, but one. She refused to tell anyone that it was she alone who had written the story, without letting Wee Millie so much as touch the pen or smell the ink once the manuscript was done. Wee Chrissy wrote then, and will tell anyone who asks now, that there is only one heart in the body. Wee Millie sits silent when she says this and lets her go ahead with her show. Wee Millie knows, though, that our hearts are separate. Our wombs, our backs, our hot puddles and buttons come in and out of each other like corsets' laces. Wee Chrissy feels Wee Millie's itches, and Wee Millie rubs on Wee Chrissy's aches. But for Wee Millie, our hearts are separate things, different as the sun and the moon pinning down the ends of a long day's sky. It is obvious to everyone that Wee Chrissy is the charming one. She is the one who the newspapers talk about when they say we're beautiful. Wee Millie thinks that she scares people. She is quiet and unsure, and if we were not us, if we were norms, or nigger girls at least, Wee Millie would never find herself within shooting distance of a stage. Wee Millie speaks German and Spanish better than Wee Chrissy, better than Mrs. Susan, who taught us. But she stays quiet, the small, silent half. Wee Chrissy is stronger, Wee Millie is frail. Wee Chrissy is pretty, Wee Millie is darker and with a gnarling nose. When Wee Chrissy smiles at the doctors and invites them to probe the body, Wee Millie plays along and feels her mouth burn with quiet. It is her feebler puddle, her crookeder pit in which they will splash and plunge to their heart's content. While wee Chrissy talks to reporters, doctors, and midway norms, wee Millie moves her mouth and smiles along, but really she sends her mind inside. Both of we two make up stories. Wee Chrissy likes to say hers, shout them from the stage, write them down in books. Wee Millie keeps her stories to herself. When Mrs. Susan heard about wee Chrissy's story, she smiled, her soft pink cheeks glowing as she chuckled. "You couldn't have convinced me that that one ever learned to read." She pointed her head at wee Chrissy. "At least not by my hand. Don't know what you all picked up on the road, I suppose." Wee Chrissy was never bothered by Mrs. Susan's comments. Wee Millie couldn't get enough of Mrs. Susan, but wee Chrissy always took her in sips, swishing her around in slow judgment whenever she was around, and spitting her name out bitterly when it was just the two of us alone. The biggest fight we ever had happened the morning of Master John's funeral. Wee Chrissy wanted to wear our star-spangled taffeta costume to the service. She said we'd be the blow-off, the grand finale of Master John's long-lived show. To her, he was a freak on his own, and a gaff, a liar at that. She said he passed for a kind master, an innocent pushed into managing us by altruism and Christian duty, but that he was really a mastermind who had plotted our course from our birth, having calculated our life's revenue by the time we were 2 months old. Wee Millie liked her skepticism, but got hot at the thought of disrespecting Mrs. Susan by wearing the dress. Wee Millie has loved Mrs. Susan forever, in the way that Norm women, she thinks, love the people who take care of them, make them feel like the secret of life lives between their two limbs. Although our midway life was clouded with people and noise, Wee Millie enjoyed the camaraderie that came with traveling with a pack of freaks. Zip Johnson, the What Is It, adopted us as his niece and would visit our tent in his furry brown costume after his Missing Link show, spinning us around in pirouettes and sharing some of the bananas he was paid to hurl at his audiences. Bearded and fat ladies of all heights and temperaments mothered us, pressing our hair and teaching us how to send our minds away from the body when Norm men came to us with their pointing parts and oily smiles. For wee Millie, Miss Ella Ewing, the Missouri giantess, was heaven itself, and the nook between her chest and her yardstick arm was a personal paradise. Miss Ella had traveled with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and it had filled her with stories that we two could listen to for days. Wee Chrissy loved to hear about the high, steady pay Miss Ella received, the handsome Indian men she performed with. Wee Millie simply liked the sad, deep moan of the giantess's voice. Wee Millie dragged the body to her every chance she got, just to curl into the nook of her chest and hear her thunderstorm breath, her earthquake heartbeat. Mrs. Susan and Master John hold our story together like bookends. We both agree on that. They were there when life set us whirling about like a spinning top, and here they are again, the lady and the ghost, now that things are starting to slow down. Master John was still living when he and Mrs. Susan came to England to get us from Lars Rochman, the most recent man to have crept into a tent and stolen us in the middle of the night. Master John was brusque as usual, but kind enough, returning wee Chrissy's buttermilk smile as he ushered us out of the Liverpool courtroom. Mrs. Susan was slower, warmer, as was her way. She held her arms out and called our names, pulling the body toward her with her scent and her feel and her promise of home. We were too young then to know that home doesn't exist unless you're far from it. Either it or you must disappear the moment you return. North Carolina was decimated after the Civil War, and by that time Master John's house was no more a home than a floor plank was a blacktop. Wee Millie was sure it was the shock of our return and the swollen weight of Mrs. Susan's misery that first brought fever to her side of the body. Wee Chrissy has always laughed those claims off. Master John died of gout before Wee Millie had a chance to feel all her pain, and our status as breadwinners for his family and ourselves became official. Wee Chrissy became our manager, making contacts with the North Carolina showmen we'd known before we left, dazzling them all with her smile and her laugh, running her ballet to keep them interested. Her act was tight and she always got her ding, as circus folks say, the clink of whatever capital against whatever pot she passed around. We needed money, of course, but Wee Chrissy was smart. She knew that a few dollars weekly from a traveling sideshow gig was all right for a pair of young nigger girl freaks without the need or the right to do for themselves. But we were grown now, almost old, and as free as we would ever be. We needed money, Wee Chrissy knew, but it was information that would make us. We Christie enlisted the help of Ron Samuel, Master John's old stableman, and set the body flitting around the marshlands of Columbus County with her ear to the tracks of the circus world, dropping Master John's good name like maple sugar candies whenever we needed white lawn protection and finding out what opportunities we could drum up for ourselves on the nation's largest stage. It was in a saloon near Sewell's Swamp that we heard the news we Christie thought would change our life forever. The barmaid was a woman who had ballyhooed for P.T. Barnum's show years before, when we were being billed as the two-headed cherub monstrosity. She was a kind woman with a ruddy face and a mess of wheat-colored hair piled on top of her head. She always liked Master John and Mrs. Susan, and we Millie thought she was nice enough to us, though we Christie insisted she was simply trying to get on Master John's good side, which, she said, meant the inside of his pants. Still, the woman smiled when we shuffled through the door sideways, and offered us a glass of lemonade, which we Millie decided we would drink. "You girls know about the nigger show?" the woman asked, watching we Christie's face for evidence that she felt or tasted the lemonade. We two shook our heads, no. "Man behind Buffalo Bill in the Wild West show, not Cody, but the money man, a Yankee. He's doing a big show about niggers. You all be perfect for it." We Millie could feel we Christie's smile spread on the skin. We Christie thanked the woman and yanked the body towards the door so quickly that we Millie had to pinch the spine to slow us down so she could pay. The woman smiled, and we Millie felt her eyes on the body as we ambled out the door. We Millie glad to be heading home as always. We Christie dreaming of New York City, plotting the course of our life anew. Thank you.
For putting this together, and thank you guys all for coming. So excited to have this conversation with Mecca.
Me too.
Mecca, I love that story. It's one of my, I have many favorites actually in the collection, but that one is one of my favorites. It's so strange and wonderful. And I hope you guys pick up the book and finish that story. It ends in such a heartbreaking, beautiful way. So I thought we could actually start with that story. Mostly because you also introduced that story by saying that you write a lot about voice and how voice is connected to the body.
Sure.
And that's such a good example of obviously this strange body, these girls, who I think are based on real girls.
They are.
Yeah, who traveled in the freak show circuit. And two little black girls, and they think of themselves as sort of one little black girl. It's complicated, but the way that you've chosen to create this voice to give them, that we Christie, our body, but one where his niece, is just so interesting. Can you just talk more about those choices?
So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. This, I am always thinking about voice and sort of the ways in which our voices, sort of articulate bodily experience in ways that just, static images can't. And I see voice as a kind of, as a tool for really getting at some of the complexities of certain bodily experiences, especially the strange ones, right? I mean, there are ways in which you might look at a body or a pair of bodies like that, conjoined twins, black women conjoined twins born into slavery, right? And have a certain set of ideas about who they are and what their inner lives are like. And of course, the only way you can kind of disrupt or complicate some of those images is by listening, or in this case, reading them. And so I really wanted to kind of think of ways that in which the voice of the narrator, could sort of articulate some of that complexity, that multiplicity, and even conflict. That I think these are sisters, and like any pair of sisters, right? There's drama between them, and yet they're bound. They're bound physically to one another, and that sort of makes for all of these interesting tensions and possibilities. I'm thinking very strongly about a novel based on the two of them for that reason.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because I mean, when I was done with the story, I was not done with them.
Yeah, well, we're not done with them either.
Okay.
So I'm excited. No, that's great.
That.
Yeah, that's exciting. But it's something that's present in all the stories, though. I think about the first story, Wolfpack, where you use multiple first-person narratives to get across the pack voice. But even there's a lot happening with body. You use terms like big, black bodies, that sometimes the terms are even off-putting. And I just wonder if you could talk more about that. I mean, how you are presenting bodies, especially women's bodies. You know, in the New York Times, there was an article in the New York Times recently. I don't know if you guys read this, and the heading was "What Makes a Woman," and it was a whole argument that's about, I mean, lots of stuff, but having to do with what is the woman in the body. Is the woman in the breast? Is the woman in the vagina? What does that mean? And so I thought, you're saying something about women's bodies, and I was wondering if you could say something more to us about that.
No, that's really great. And it's interesting to think about it in terms of this conversation that we're having on a kind of very popular national stage about gender
for better
and
or worse. I don't know if I'm down with how poppy it is,
sure.
But yeah.
Well, and of course, there are some of us who've been having similar conversations in a sort of explicitly not poppy way for decades, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, at the same time, we're also having conversations about, for example, the McKinney pool party, right, where you see young Black women's bodies, sort of taking center stage, and being kind of desubjectivated, not to get too academic, being kind of evacuated, sort of rendered void of subjectivity. This question of, is the woman in the body? In some ways, I think another way of framing that is sort of, is the body for the woman? Is the body, is the body the locus of the woman? And is there a way to understand the woman in order to understand the body in a more complex and more interesting way? And for me, that is absolutely what I'm trying to kind of get at in these stories, is really kind of thinking about, how the kind of static image of bodies, and we see images of women's bodies all the time, and we're encouraged to kind of read them in very particular ways. And yet, the voice really allows us to think differently about some of those things. So in Wolfpack, the story that you mentioned, it was important to me to tell that story from multiple perspectives precisely for that reason. One of the things that was interesting, this is a story that's about the case of the New Jersey Four, which, there are 4 Black lesbian women from New Jersey, from New York, who in 2006 were convicted of felony gang assault of a man who threatened to rape them in the West Village. They were kind of hanging out on the pier in Christopher Street, and they were verbally assaulted, then a physical fight kind of ensued, and 77 women were charged. 3 of them accepted plea bargains, and 4 of them were sentenced. The sentences ranged from 6 months probation to 11 years in prison, and the youngest of these women was 19 at the time. She was the one who received the 11-year sentence. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about that story and about that case was the way in which languages of kind of dehumanization of bodies circulated throughout, right? So it isn't just a simple case of, this guy, curses, yells at them, and they attack him, right? And there's this fight. He also, before he threatened to rape one of the women, he called another one of the women an elephant, right? The big Black woman, right, gets called an elephant. Then in the media coverage, it was shocking to me to see how the New York Post, but also the Times, right, referring to them as a wolf pack, a swarm, right? All of these, again, these dehumanizing languages are readings of their bodies that evacuate them of subjectivity, of humanity and human complexity, right? And so for me, the only way to kind of write against that and to try and understand all of what's going on in that kind of move was to try and tell the story from multiple points of view and showing, kind of showing multiple human perspectives on that same kind of bodily violence.
Yeah, and you're writing about such important stuff and doing it so well. So we're both professors, and I was actually recently observed teaching a creative writing class. I won't say too much because I don't want to get the person who observed me in trouble, except to say that after I was observed by this senior person in my faculty, she asked me, I was kind of confused by what you were doing in that class. It was a creative writing class. It's a literature class, but in the class, I was looking at the students' work as a way to sort of allow the students' work to be a participant in a conversation of literature. So my class is called Girls, which I know I'm going to teach some of your stories. And we read all these texts by women and men, but all the characters are girls. And then at the end of class, I have my students give us their work where they have girls as characters, and we read their work with the same kind of literary language that we've been reading the literature, which I think is really awesome for grad students, right? To be able to place their work alongside the canon or tradition. Okay, So this person is observing me, and she says, I'm gonna get this person in trouble, but she says to me, you know, what were you doing? Like, was that like a gender studies class? In the most dismissive kind of way, you know? And as if to say, it couldn't be a literature class. It definitely couldn't be a class in a creative writing program. It must be, it's a sociology class, right? And I had to make an argument for, you know, creating character is obviously a creative writing element, and thinking about race and gender is how you have to, if you're creating a character who has a vagina, like you have to think about what that means to carry around a vagina all the time. I mean, if you're creating a character who is race, which means all of us, we have to think about what that means to walk around with whatever particular skin color, you know, and what the history is that arrives on that body. And I feel like it's clear in your work that you are considering those things, and you're not afraid to consider them. In fact, you're so clear in your consideration because your stories often are coming out of actual historical, political realities. Like both these stories we've been talking about so far, the Wolfpack and A Strange People. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your decision to be political, even though you were writing belletristically. You know, you're writing creatively, but you're not shying away from writing like obvious political material, which I applaud. And I wonder if you could just talk about how you're balancing that and what some of the struggles are, or not, the pleasures, whatever.
Well, so first of all, that sounds like a great class. And it sounds, I love the structure, and I love how that class kind of combines, you know, the theoretical and the kind of literary with the creative. For me, I think, you know, and of course, through this, what some might read as a kind of political frame, right? It's interesting because for me, it isn't a choice. As you said, I mean, I tend to write about Black women. Part of that is because that's, you know, that's my experience. But also I think there's more to it than that in terms of, you know, really, I find Black women extremely interesting, and I find our experiences in the diaspora on a kind of global scale really interesting, not only because of, you know, sort of politics, but also because of all of the ways in which politics impact our emotional lives, our inner lives, our imaginative lives. And so, you know, in a way, I mean, as you said, in order to do that, not only responsibly, but to do it well and sort of beautifully, I think, you have to deal with the social reality. So when I teach creative writing courses, I teach setting as a kind of social reality, right? You can't think of setting as just, you know, sort of geographical setting. You can't think of it as just physical setting. It's not just sort of, you know, what walls shape the room. It's who made the walls that shape the room. Who are the people that shape the space within the room, right? And that you can't do setting right without thinking about a social setting. So part of it, you know, I think I'm absolutely aware of some of the challenges of kind of dealing explicitly with questions of gender and race and sexuality and class. But for me, it's less of a choice and more of a kind of responsibility to the stories that I want to tell. And as you said, there are tremendous pleasures too. I mean, I think, you know, I love description. That's kind of, you know, the thing that I do. I love voice, I love character. And so, you know, in engaging with those elements of craft, you know, it forces me to think about what the characters are experiencing in a kind of social context. In some ways, it's just conflict. You know, it's setting and it's conflict and it's character. If they're Black women and, you know, Black queer women, then that becomes political in a different way. But as you said, really setting conflict and character should be political for all of us.
I have one more question and then we'll open it up to you guys. So I hope you guys have questions as well. I mean, I have a ton of questions, but the question I'll ask is a little bit more subdued. I'm curious about how you form your stories as far as length. There's some stories that are really quite long, and there's some that are really tiny, almost flash. I just wonder what your relationship is to those different forms.
That's interesting. So on the way over here, I was thinking about how, I was wondering if you were going to ask me a question about influences. And I was like, I always say, I'm kind of like, I mean, I always say Toni Morrison, I always say Audre Lorde, and then the rest is just kind of like a crapshoot because there are so many. But with the collection in particular, Jamaica Kincaid, her collection of short stories At the Bottom of the River was a real kind of model for me. My mom, who's in the audience, had a copy. I think I discovered it when I was like 10, 11, too young to really kind of be reading some of their stories, but also to sort of make sense of what she was doing formally. But those stories are so daring and you know, hailed as kind of experimental. In fact, when they came out, most people didn't read them as short stories, and she got a lot of kind of criticism for them because they were sort of like, what are these things? Flash fiction wasn't a term that was necessarily circulating, but people read them as prose poetry. And I think for me, those shorter pieces, they reflect my investment in character and voice, and in very kind of micro level plot movements, sort of the changing of a mind, the changing of a perspective, a kind of a shift in a relationship. Those, I think, are the things that I'm exploring in some of those shorter stories, and in some of the longer stories as well. But I really enjoy, playing with different forms. And the same way we've been talking about voice, I love playing with different voices. The same is true, I think, across the collection. I like playing with different, sort of ways of structuring a story, different kinds of, plot arcs and story structures. It was fun, and for that reason, it was a fun collection to write.
Good. I mean, I think this thing that we do, it should be fun.
Sure.
This idea that all of us are like, I don't want to ever write. I'm like, well, then don't do it.
Right.
Like, go be a chef or something.
Exactly.
So I'm glad that it was fun. Yeah, and it's fun reading, even though some of the stories are tough,
Sure.
Emotionally tough, but it's fun reading. Okay, you guys, questions?
I have a question. Do you ever get frustrated just, the way people tend, like how you were talking about getting categorized, like, can you just speak about that a little more? I mean, I can identify with that idea, so maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
I mean, it's interesting, so this is my first book. I think that, I've been publishing for a long time, and some of my publications are in, Black publications or queer publications or women's magazines. I am assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies at UMass Amherst, right? So there are these ways in which I find myself in, in settings that are organized around either identity, if you think of it that way, or around kind of a social category. And I haven't, I think my feelings about it have kind of shifted. But at the end of the day, Toni Morrison has this brilliant moment, right, where she says, if there's a story that you need to read and it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. Mm-hmm. And that is precisely why I write. And so I'm writing for the people who need my stories, I mean, I'm writing for everyone, and I like to think that everyone could learn something, mm-hmm. and feel something and maybe be changed or challenged by what I write. But at the end of the day, if it happens to be that, Black people or New Yorkers, people from Harlem, hip-hop fans, like whatever kind of, quote-unquote niche market connects with and needs my writing, I'm all the way there for that,
mm-hmm.
And I'm happy about that.
I mean, Toni Morrison also has a great quote where she says, I'm not going to quote it, but she says something to the effect like, if you're writing inside of this box, and her box, she says, is the experience of African-American women, well, that's the world. You can write the whole world in that, and there's no need to feel as though that's a constraint. I want to write universally. Well, the whole universe can be, as Morrison says, in the Black woman experience. And we have writers who write just the white male experience, and they say they're writing the world.
And it's not political somehow, right?
Well, exactly. And I mean, the problem is, and even just as a woman in general, it's like, as soon as a woman writes something with a female character, it will easily get put in chick lit, And I think, there are a lot of great conversations going on these days about diversity, and so that's great. And I think things are getting slowly better. Hopefully, I think in the States especially, everyone's starting to realize like everyone here is from somewhere else.
Right.
So it's not like, in my point of view, I don't think, it's like Black literature. It's just literature, like you said. And I'd hope that more people understand that. Yeah.
And I think in having this conversation, it's important to mention some of the people and organizations that are doing this work of thinking critically about, quote-unquote diversity in publishing. VITA, right, Women in Literary Arts, they've really kind of brought a lot of attention to gender dynamics within the publishing world. And I think it was Kate Nelson, who works with VITA, who published, I don't know if she publishes or just posted it on Facebook, but she's done some research. And it turns out that in the last 15 years, there hasn't been a single Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist that had a woman protagonist. Which, I haven't done the kind of follow-up research to back that up. But that if that's even close to true, that's really striking, right? And you kind of have to look at some of those. It's interesting how statistics, numbers, kind of, you know, bring these conversations to the fore and solidify things that we kind of sensed and known for a long time.
There was a question right.
Hi, thank you very much for that. That was a great piece you did. Thank you. I'm not familiar with the other stories as yet, but my question has to do with writing cross-culturally. Like, I was having a conversation with someone, and I was thinking, like, how can you write about a culture that you haven't experienced yourself? So I know you know, before you write a book, you do a lot of research. But last year I read this wonderful book. It was a debut, and it was called The House Girl. And the woman that wrote it, she was a Caucasian woman. But when as I was reading the book, I kept flipping back looking at the picture because I couldn't believe it, because she did such a phenomenal job. And then I saw an interview that she had done. It was a post-publication interview, I believe it was. And she said that she really spoke to the character. She spoke to the characters because she respected them. So not a lot, but people who try to write cross-culturally from a place that they haven't experienced themselves, I kind of changed my perspective because she did that. Because usually when authors try to approach it, like, I don't know, like, where they're coming from, but when I read her book, it just changed my whole perspective about it, because now I see, okay, it can be done in a way that's like respectful and it's not like degrading or anything of that nature.
So I think it's interesting. I think that's a really good question. And to be honest, we actually talked about this in another setting. You know, it's a question that I kind of confront all the time. Part of writing stories about young Black women in Harlem in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s means that these are characters who are coming across people from a wide range of backgrounds, right? And, you know, speaking a lot of different languages, especially given my concern with voice. You have a lot of different dialects coming into play, a lot of different sort of approaches to English language and multiple other languages. And my choice is to always represent the full story, or tell the full story, even if that means thinking about characters whose experiences are different from my own. I mean, on a big kind of conceptual macro level, we're all writing characters whose experiences are different, right? I think part of the meat of the question is, what are the politics involved in that choice? And I think this is where this question of being responsible kind of comes in. What does that kind of responsibility look like? I really don't know. I don't know for sure if there's a way to, write a character whose subject position is different from your own, especially if you hold a position of privilege, right? If you are a white person writing characters of color, if you are a man writing women characters, if you're a straight person writing queer characters, you have to think about those things. And I don't know if there's like a right way to do it. I've had that experience, and but I do think that thinking about and being aware of the political dynamics and the kind of social dynamics involved in that creative practice is really important. In the collection, there are a lot of moments where I kind of came across some of those questions. One in particular, a story about a 14-year-old girl that's set in contemporary Ethiopia. I've never been to Ethiopia. It's a story that I really kind of wanted to write. It's about reproductive and sexual rights and Planned Parenthood in Ethiopia. And so it involved a lot of research just to kind of, create the world of the story. But it also involved a whole lot of kind of introspection and soul searching, really sort of thinking about, why am I writing this story? Is this a story that I need to write? Is this a story that anyone else needs to read from me? And those are questions that, even though the book sits here before us, I'm still asking myself those questions. And I hope to continue to ask myself those questions, even as I continue to do the writing and the kind of socially thoughtful writing that I plan to do.
But do you think it helps you grow as a person? Because in your writing, when you're exploring and researching, you're learning more about yourself.
Absolutely.
And about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. And again, I still, given this conversation that we're having about who's published, how, whose voice is sort of heard, I do have to ask myself, as someone born and raised in the U.S., is my sort of personal growth the most important thing in this moment? You know what I mean? And again, so for me, I publish these stories not really for not really just for my personal growth, but because that was the story that I really wanted to tell. And I did as much research as I could, but again, I think a lot of the research really comes from, again, kind of self-interrogation. That's a great question.
Any other questions? Come on.
So my question is actually similar to the previous one. I know that you did a lot of research for this story, and you also know Mrs. Monkey.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, I absolutely figured it out. It's a classic. I'm already determined that it's a classic.
As a novel.
I wondered in your research, and how much are you amplifying the voices that you learned that they had their own, and how much are you extending their voice to help to explicate the complexity of Black women's lives, which I think you are doing now, in opposition to stereotypes and misunderstandings of Black women, if that's clear.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, I'm glad that you brought up stereotypes, because I think that's very much sort of what if I'm writing against anything, it's this idea of kind of monolithic image of Black womanhood. So with the McCoy twins, so their names are Millie and Christine McCoy, and they wrote an autobiography, right? So right there's all these kind of interesting questions of genre and personhood and who, and narrator, right? What the narrator is. It's a very short narrative. You can find it. I think it's UNC has it in their holdings, and I think they recently digitized it. Kayla, you would know. Is it UNC? Okay. And so so in this narrative, first of all, the subtitle is "A Strange People," and that line "A Strange People" kind of occurs, right? And of course, there is no sense of they don't. The pronoun is a relatively stable, first person plural we, and yet, what does it mean to have an autobiography written by a we? It's totally fascinating and gets to all of these questions about the multiplicity and complexity of Black women's bodies and lives, right? What does it mean to have two young Black women who are joined in body, at least to some extent, and have to travel around with one another, but clearly have different personalities, right? Or may at least have different personalities that are not paid attention to. So this is the other thing in terms of media coverage, right? Some of those headlines are actual headlines used to describe them. United Negroes Freaks, double-headed darky. So they're kind of, sometimes they're thought of as one person, sometimes they're thought of as something else. And I think, I think of that in some ways as a metaphor for the way we read bodies that are different across lines of race, gender, and ability. Sort of looking at a body that looks weird, you think you know what that weirdness is and what it means, and perhaps you think of it as, you think of it as weird in some other way, and yet there's likely to be some further complexity that you might even be able to connect with, right, if you were to really kind of get to that person's interior.
Another question?
I have a question on a totally different note. I wonder how do you find time to write as an academic? And I have it's actually a two-part question. How do you find time to write as an academic, and how does your writing affect your teaching and vice versa?
Sure. Thank you, Carolyn. Well, you actually helped me. This is Carolyn Fellows, the author of Don't Erase Me. You helped me kind of start to figure this out in the very early stages when I was still a grad student. Tiffany and I were just talking about that as well.
Just 2 seconds.
Like just 2 seconds ago, yeah. And we were going to continue later, so I can continue. I mean, I think it's hard. It's really hard. And my year here at the Center for Fiction had everything to do with that. It was a year where I had finished the draft of my dissertation, and I decided I was going to take a year and work on fiction and not be affiliated. And I mean, I was still, a student, but I wasn't affiliated. And so I gave myself time to work on this and to work on the novel that I'm now finishing up. But it's interesting that you said this, literally right now at this moment, I'm, you know, kind of going back and putting the finishing touches on the novel before I send it to my agent, and I'm finishing my perspectives for my scholarly book that, you know, that will have to be turned in soon. So it's hard, but I think part of what makes it easier is the fact that there are overlaps. So in my scholarship, I look at the connections between poetic form, you know, sort of narrative strategy, craft strategy, and identity in women's literature of the African diaspora. So I think pretty much every writer that we've talked about today is someone that I work on in this book. These, you know, these questions of voice and body are very much part of my research. Sometimes that can be really daunting because it means there's no such thing as pleasure reading anymore, and there hasn't been for about 8 years, you know. And yet it means that, you know, my work is pleasurable. And I do feel that it sort of feeds my creative life. But the time thing, I mean, you know, some people I think are writers who sort of work, you know, hour by hour. I kind of section off weeks, days, weeks, months. In the case of my fellowship here, a year, and just allow myself to devote myself to my fiction.
This is Noreen Tomasi. She's the head of the Center for Fiction.
It's so great to see you.
It's
First
great to
of all,
see you.
wonderful. But you know how excited I am about that novel, and I have a couple related questions about it. You don't have to speak about it now if you don't want to. I understand that, but I'm really curious to hear more about how it's evolved. But I also feel in working on the novel and working on the stories together at the same time, was one a relief from the other? Do you feel in your heart of hearts you're more a novelist or a story writer or both? Or
That's a great question. You know, I don't know. I really don't know. Sometimes I do. I mean, sometimes, you know, this question of structure, story structure, sometimes I feel like, okay, maybe I'm just trying to write a novel, right? And in fact, 2 of the stories in here, you know, Strange People, I think will be a novel eventually. And in fact, one of the stories is kind of a chapter in the novel that I'm working on. So I don't know. I think I may be a novelist, but I think I may be one of those novelists that'll occasionally just write a couple of stories or even a whole collection. There's something I think really freeing about the kind of economy with language in the short story form. There's something, I mean, on one hand, it's kind of, you know, there's a constraint, obviously, but at the same time, it allows you to kind of free yourself to really kind of make hard choices in a way I think that, you know, a novel doesn't require you to do. And I enjoy that. And the other thing, too, is that, you know, in terms of working on them both at the same time, stories were finite things that I was able to kind of, you know, complete and then send off for feedback and come back to between exams or semesters, between, you know, milestones in the PhD program. And so that was very useful for me then, and I think that the way the academic calendar works, that might continue to be the case. So I think I'll end up doing both. And I'd love to talk to you about the novel. It's changed a lot, and it's like, it's close, so I'm excited about it.
has it, but it still takes up some of the issues you've been talking about tonight.
Absolutely, yeah. So the novel is about a young Black woman who goes from a kind of morbidly obese 6-year-old into a morbidly obese 15-year-old, and sort of thinking about her family, how that sort of change plays against the gentrification of Harlem, and the kind of impacts of gender and class on the way her body is read. So absolutely, it's, you know, very much in conversation with what we've been talking about tonight. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. I think this side of the room has been so quiet.
Hi. I don't know if you already asked this, Tiffany, but do you have an ideal reader in mind when you write things, and if it is, who is your ideal reader?
You know, that's a really good question. I have not been aware of thinking of an ideal reader, although one thing that's great about publishing a book is that then you hear from readers that you don't know, and who aren't even sort of so close in your orbit. I think publishing stories, you hear from friends and friends of friends, but like, you know, I've gotten emails from people who like really not only seem to get what I'm trying to do, which is nice, but I'm also, you know, death of the author, all of that. I don't need people to understand the stories in the way that I understand them, but people who will say things like, I really needed that story. That is my ideal reader. And I, you know, again, I think that kind of cuts across lines of, you know, race, class, and gender. At the same time, you know, like I got an email from a girl from Baltimore named Jamilah, and I was like, hey, yeah, you're my reader too, definitely, you know, and I'm glad because, you know, when me and, you know, black girl from Harlem named Jamilah needed this book, it wasn't there, so I'm glad that it's there for her.
Thank you, Mecca. This has been a wonderful
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you guys all for coming.